Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Our topic today is using interviews part 2. In first part, we started with the definition of interview, different types of interviews, different purposes of interviews, and designing interview questions according to different types, like structured interview or unstructured interview. And we discussed a number of questions which can be formed in each type of a questionnaire. The next part or the stage of interview is interviewing, which means how to conduct an interview effectively. So some of the points we are going to discuss today are the setting up and conducting the interview, the role of interviewer, the essential guidelines for the conduct of an effective interview, transcribing the interview data, analyzing the data, transcribing the data, verifying the data, and then reporting the data. And if we got a chance and time, we'll discuss about other types of interviews like group interviewing, or interviewing children, or focus group interviews, or the non-directive interview, telephonic interview, and at the end we'll discuss some ethical issues in interviewing. So let's begin with the first topic, that is the setting up and conducting the interview. It is the next stage in the procedure of planning an interview, where the interviewers are initiating the research themselves. They will clearly select their own respondents. Where interviews are engaged by another agent or another organization, then they will probably given a list of people to contact. So that is the stage to find the people you are going to interview and whether they are appropriate for the purpose you are doing the research or not. The interviewer should inform the participants about the nature of or purpose of the interview, and tell them being honest yet without risking any biases, and should strive to put the participants at ease. The conduct of the interview should be explained, how the structure or the way the interview will be conducted should be explained to the respondents. For example, telling them what will happen and how it will happen, and the structure and organization of the interview, how the responses would be recorded, and to seek permission if it is required, and these procedures should be observed throughout the interview. During the interview, the biases and values of the interviewer should not be revealed. The biases or the personal opinions of the interviewer shouldn't be revealed to the respondents, and the interview should avoid giving judgments. The interview may have to steer the respondents if they are rumbling about or they are beating about the bush, but without becoming impolite. It is crucial to keep uppermost in one's mind the fact that interview is a social, interpersonal encounter, not merely a data collection exercise. So there should be a rapport and friendly relationship with the interviewee. What makes an effective interviewer, or what an interviewer should keep in while conducting an interview? An interview follows an unwritten script to the interactions, the rules of which only surface when they are transgressed. The researcher is the research instrument, and the effective interviewer is not only knowledgeable about his subject matter, but also an expert in interaction and communication. The interviewer will need to establish an appropriate atmosphere such that the participant can feel secure to talk freely. So there is a need to address the following issues. Number one, the cognitive aspect of the interview. Ensuring that the interview is sufficiently knowledgeable about the subject matter. Number two, the ethical dimension of the interview needs to be borne in mind, ensuring, for example, informed consent, guarantees of confidentiality, beneficence and non-maleficence, which means that the interview may be to the advantage of respondent and will not harm his or her in any way. So these should be kept in mind and explained to the interviewee in advance. So there is a need to address the interpersonal, interactional, communicative and emotional aspects of the interview. For example, the interviewer and interviewee communicate non-verbally by facial and bodily expressions. Something as slight as a shift in position in a chair might convey whether the researcher is interested, angry, bored, agreeing, disagreeing, and so on. And these should be kept in mind all the time. The onus is on the interviewer to establish and maintain a good rapport with the interviewee. This concerns being clear, polite, non-threatening, friendly, and personable, to the point. But above all, the interviewer shouldn't be assertive on these points. The interviewer is also responsible for considering the dynamics of the situation. For example, how to keep the conversation going, how to motivate participants to discuss their thoughts, feelings, and experiences, how to overcome the problems of the likely asymmetries of power in the interview, where the interviewer typically defines the situation, the topic, the conduct, the introduction, the course of the interview, and the closing of the interview. How an interview can be a directive in conducting the interview. The directiveness of the interview has been scaled by Wyatt in 1982, where on a point scale, a 6-point scale of directiveness, and responding was devised, where 1 is equivalent the least directive and 6 the most directive. Directive means leading towards what the researcher wants to get from the interviewee. So on the scale, 1 is the least directive and number 6 is the most directive. So if the interviewer making encouraging noises like ha, showing interest, it shows he is less, the least directive, and that should be encouraged. Interviewer should encourage the interviewee to continue. The second could be reflecting on marks made by the informant. So if the interviewer is reflecting or referring to the marks which were given by the interviewee, that would be an interruption, and that would be a kind of directiveness. The third higher level or more intrusion is the probing on the last remark made by the informant, and number 4, probing an idea preceding the last remark by the informant, and number 5, probing an idea expressed earlier in the interview, and number 6, introducing a new topic. So this could be pursued even further, suggesting that the age, gender, race, class, dress, language of the interviewers and interviewees will all exert an influence on the interview itself. It is said that if there are women interviewers, white, English speaking, they would have a different response from the interviewees from a black interviewer. And the research has been documented in which the same types of interviews were conducted, but they came to a different type of responses. Then the sequence and framing of the interview questions will also need to be considered. For example, making sure that easier and less threatening, non-controversial questions are addressed earlier in the interview in order to put respondents at their ease. This might mean that what questions precede the most searching and difficult how and why questions. If they are asked towards the middle or towards the end of the interview. The interview will also need to consider the kinds of questions to be put to interviewees discussed earlier in our sessions. There could be many problems in the conduct of an interview. What could be the problems or issues, and interview should be aware of those problems. Well, there should be avoiding interruptions. Interview should think about avoiding interruptions from outside, and interruptions could be, for example, telephone calls, people knocking at the door, and before the interviewer starts the interview, should keep these interruptions and make a way how to overcome them, and try to minimize the distractions. Minimizing the risk of stage fright in interviewees and interviewers, what's planned for that? Avoiding asking embarrassing or awkward questions. Jumping from one topic to another. Giving advice or opinions rather than active listening. I'll say again, the interviewer shouldn't give advice or opinions, but more focus should be on active listening, what the interviewees are saying. Summarizing too early or closing off an interview too soon is another problem, and being too superficial. Handling sensitive matters, legal matters, personal matters, or emotional matters. So interviewing interviewing is a complex process. An interviewer should be aware of what could happen before, after, or during the interview. There are certain suggestions for an interviewer, and they should be followed, and if they are followed properly, it will lead to an effective interview. Where interviewer must appear to be interested in interviewing and in interviewing process. Interviewer should keep to the interview design or a schedule in a structured interview. Avoid giving signs of approval or disapproval of responses received. Be prepared to repeat questions at the respondent's request. Be prepared to move on to another question without irritation or annoying if the respondent indicates unwillingness or inability to answer the question, and ensure that the interviewer understands a response, checking if necessary. Am I right in thinking that you mean type of phrases or sentences to check whether the interviewer has understood the interview properly. If a response is inadequate, but the interviewer feels that the respondent may have more to say, thank the respondent and add, and could you please tell me now? Give the respondent time to answer. That is, avoid answering the question for the respondent. These are some of the suggestions for any interviewer to keep in while conducting an interviewing. So what is an ideal interview? So let's discuss some of the points which make an interesting or an ideal interview. The ideal interview meets several quality criteria, such as the extent of spontaneous, rich, specific and relevant answers from the interviewee. The shorter the interviewer's questions and the longer the subject's answers, the better. So the interviewer's question should be short, but the response of the interview should be long. That makes a good interview. Then the degree to which the interviewer follows up and clarifies the meanings of the relevant aspects of an answer. The ideal interview is, to a large extent, interpreted throughout the interview. The interviewer attempts to verify his or her interpretations of the subject's answers in the course of the interview. The interview is self-communicating. It is a story contained in itself that hardly requires much extra description and explanation. Another aspect of interviewing is that it is quite possible that people won't cooperate all the time, and no cooperation could lead in different forms, and as an interviewer should be aware of these type of behaviors. So people may be non-cooperative, cooperative in a different ways. For example, they not give a reason for refusing. They refuse, but they won't give a reason. Be hostile to what they see as intrusion. Hold anti-authoritarian feelings. Don't like authoritative attitude if it is displayed or shown by the interviewer. Feel that surveys are a waste of time. Speak a foreign language. Take an instant dislike to the interviewer. Say that they are too busy, or feel embarrassed or ignorant, or dislike the topic under discussion or review. Be afraid of the consequences of participating. Threatened. May feel inadequate or that they do not know the right answers. So any of these can happen, and they have happened and reported in literature on interviewing. So interview must be aware of such types of behavior from the interviewees. Next stage in interviewing, when the data has been collected and it is in the form of a chaos, a mass of data. So it should be properly transcribed. But the transcribing process reduces data to a large extent, and there are many issues related with this one. And now we are going to describe what is transcribing means in interviewing. Well, transcribing is a crucial step in interviewing, for there is the potential for massive data loss, distortion, and the reduction of complexity. It has been suggested throughout that the interview is a social encounter, not merely a data collection exercise. The problem with much transcription is that it becomes solely a record of data rather than a record of a social encounter. Indeed, this problem might have begun at the data collection stage, for example, and audio tape is selective. It filters out important contextual factors, neglecting the visual and non-verbal aspects of the interview. Indeed, it is frequently the non-verbal communication that gives more information than the verbal communication. So the transcriptions are decontextualized, they are detached from the context, and they are made abstract from time and space, from the dynamics of the situation, from the live form, and from the social, interactive, dynamic, and fluid dimensions of their source. They are rather frozen during the transcribing process. Well, if it is a transcript of the audio tape, what the interviewer should be aware of and what the interviewer should look for, what was being said, will be number one. And how it is said, how it was said, the tone of voice of the speaker or speakers, whether that was harsh, kindly, encouraging, the inflection of the voice, whether it was rising or falling, a question or a statement, a cadence or a pause, a summarizing or exploratory tone, opening or a closing or a line of inquiry, emphasis placed by the speaker. Pauses, short or long, silences, short to long, interruptions, the mood of the speaker or speakers, for example, whether they were excited, angry, resigned, bored, enthusiastic, committed, happy, grudging, etc. The speed of the talk, that were fast to slow, hurried or unhurried, hesitant to confident. Then how many people were speaking simultaneously, overlapping? Whether a speaker was speaking continuously or in short phrases, or who is speaking to whom, or some speech is indecipherable. The speaker said something, but on the tape it is not audible or not understandable. So it is indecipherable. Any other events that were taking place at the same time that the researcher can recall. So all these things should be kept in mind while transcribing the transcript, looking at the transcript of the audio tape. After the transcript, the process of analyzing starts, and we turn now to that area. So once the data have been collected, the next stage involves analyzing them, often by some form of coding or scoring. In qualitative type of data, the data analysis is almost inevitably interpretive. The data analysis is less a completely accurate representation, as in the numerical or in positivist tradition. It will be more of a reflexive, reactive interaction between the researcher and the decontextualized data that are already interpretations of a social encounter. The great tension in data analysis, however, is between maintaining a sense of the holism of the interview and the tendency for analysis to atomize and fragment the data, to separate them into constituent elements, thereby losing the synergy of the whole. And in interviews, often the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. So there are several stages in analysis. For example, generating natural units of meaning, classifying, categorizing, and ordering these units of meaning, structuring narratives to describe the interview contents, interpreting the interview data. Researchers on interviewing have identified different stages in analysis. They can be summarized into 4 positions or in 4 stages. First, generating natural units of meaning. Second, classifying, categorizing, and ordering these units of meaning. And number 3, structuring narratives to describe the interview contents. And number 4, interpreting the interview data. Well, there are certain tactics or strategies for generating meaning from the data collected. So tactics for generating meaning from transcribed and interview data. Look at the data and look for the counting frequencies, the frequencies of occurrence of different ideas, themes, pieces of data, words. So what is their frequency in the data you have gathered? Trying to put some meaning or get some sense of the data collected through the interview. Then noting patterns and themes which may stem from repeated themes and causes or explanations or constructs. What are the repeated patterns and themes? Then looking at or seeing plausibility, trying to make good sense of data using informed intuition to reach a conclusion. And then looking at clustering, making clusters of the information together, setting items into categories, types, behaviors, and classifications. Another way of generating a meaning from the data is making metaphors, using figurative and connotative language rather than literal and denotative language, but bringing data to life, thereby reducing data, making patterns, decentering the data, and connecting data with some theory. Next could be tactic to or a strategy for generating meaning is splitting the variables to elaborate, differentiate, and unpack ideas. That is to move away from the drive towards integration and the blurring of data, and subsuming particulars into the general, moving from the particulars to make some general patterns. Notion of constant comparison, which is like glaces, suggested a move towards clarifying key concepts. And another meaning generating from the data strategy is factoring, which means bringing a large number of variables under a smaller number of frequently unobserved hypothetical variables, identifying and noting relations between variables, and then finding intervening variables, looking for other variables that appear to be getting in the way of counting for what one would expect to be strong relationship between variables, and then building a logical chain of evidence, noting causality and making inferences from the data, and making conceptual and theoretical coherence, that is moving from metaphors to constructs to theories to explain the phenomena. So these are some of the tactics of generating meaning from the data, which has been documented by in literature on interviewing. It usually takes time and a frequent reading to get some meaning from the data, which in a raw form seems to be just a chaotic or a chaos or just a mess of unrelated ideas and themes. But by looking it carefully and reading it hard several times will generate some kind of data which can be categorized in these tactics or strategies I've just mentioned. Next stage in interviewing, when you have collected the data, transcribe it, next stage is how to code the data. So coding is an important stage or step in interviewing. It has been defined by Carlinga as the translation of question responses and respondent information to specific categories for the purpose of analysis. So as we have seen, many questions are pre-coded. That is, each response can be immediately and directly converted into a score in an objective way. So different types of scales, rating scales, and checklists are examples of pre-coded questions. So coding is the ascription of a category label to a piece of data, with the category label either decided in advance or in response to the data that have been collected. Here I'll give you an example of a content analysis and what type of categories are maybe given to a data on content analysis. So number one, there is a briefing, understanding the problem and its context in detail. And number two, sampling of people, including the types of sample sought. Associating with other work that has been done. Developing a hypothesis. Testing the hypothesis. Immersing in the data. Immersing in the data collected to pick up all the clues. Categorizing, in which the categories and their labels must reflect the purpose of the research, be exhaustive, and be mutually exclusive. Incubating, reflecting on data and developing interpretations and meanings. Synthesizing, involving a review of the rationale for coding and an identification of emerging patterns and themes. Culling means condensing, excising, and even reinterpreting the data so that they can be written up intelligibly. Interpreting means making meaning of the data, and then writing, including giving clear guidance, being aware of what is not said as well as what is said, or the silences, indicating salience to the readers and respondents, and rethinking. Well, if you have a research which is based on content analysis, so you pass through these different stages during the analysis. This process requires researchers to address 13 factors. Number one, understand the research brief thoroughly. Number two, evaluate the relevance of the sample for the research project. Number three, associate their own experiences with the problem, looking for clues from the past. Number four, develop testable hypotheses as the basis for the content analysis. Number five, test the hypothesis throughout the interviewing and analysis process. Number six, stay immersed in the data throughout the study. Number seven, categorize the data and creating labels and codes. And number eight, incubate the data before writing up. And number nine, synthesize the data by looking for key concepts. And number 10, cull the data, being selective. And number 11, interpret the data, identifying its meaning and implication, and number 12, write up the report, and number 13, rethink and rewrite. Have the research objectives been met you started with? And if they are, then your process has completed. Well, there are certain guidelines for transcribing phenomenological interview data. And first of all, it's a transcription. So having the interview tape transcribed, noting not only the literal statements but also non-verbal and paralinguistic communication, like gestures, facial expressions, interruptions, as we discussed above. Then bracketing and phenomenological reduction. This means suspending as much as possible the researcher's meaning and interpretations and entering into the world of the unique individual who was interviewed, not your personal biases, but what the interviewee is telling or saying. The researcher thus sets out to understand what the interviewee is saying, rather than what he or she, as an interviewer, expects that person to say. Then listening to the interview for a sense of the whole, holism, not discrete items. This involves listening to the entire tape several times and reading the transcription a number of times in order to provide a context for the emergence of specific units of meaning and themes later on. Then delineating units of general meaning. This means a thorough scrutiny of both verbal and non-verbal gestures to elicit the participant's meaning. It is a crystallization and condensation of what the participant has said, still using as much as possible the literal words of the participant. Then training independent judges to verify the units of relevant meaning. So findings can be verified by using other researchers to carry out the above procedures. Heckner's own experience in working with graduate students well trained in this type of research is that there are rarely significant differences in the findings. Then eliminating redundancies. At this stage, the researcher checks the lists of relevant meaning and eliminates those clearly redundant to other previously listed. After that, clustering units of relevant meaning. Then the researcher now tries to determine if any of the units of relevant meaning naturally cluster together, whether there seems to be some common theme or essence that unites several discrete units of relevant meaning, determining themes from clusters of meaning. The researcher examines all the clusters of meaning to determine if there is one or more central theme or themes which express the essence of those clusters, and then writing a summary of each individual interview. Then return to the participant with a summary and themes, conducting a second interview. This could be a check to see whether the essence of the first interview has been accurately and fully captured. Modifying themes and summary. With the new data from the second interview, the researcher looks at all the data as a whole and modifies or adds themes as necessary. Then identifying general and unique themes for all the interviews. The researcher looks for the themes common to most or all of the interviews, as well as the individual variations among them. The first step is to note if there are themes common to all or most of the interviews. The second step is to note when there are themes that are unique to a single interview or a minority of the interviews. Then contextualization of themes. At this point, it is helpful to place these themes back within the overall context or horizons from which these themes emerged, and then writing a composite summary. And about this, Heckner 1985 considers it useful to write up a composite summary of all the interviews that would accurately capture. Next step after transcribing is verifying or validating. So validity must take place at all stages of the interview-based investigation. And what are those stages? There are 7 stages of the interview-based investigation. The first, the theoretical foundation of the research must be rigorous, and there must be a logical link between such theory and the research questions, and it should be verified or validated. Number 2, all aspects of research design, all aspects of the research design must be sound and rigorous. Number 3, the data must be accurate, reliable and valid, with consistency and reliability checks undertaken. Number 4, the translation of the data from an oral to a written medium must demonstrate fidelity to the key features of the interview situation. Number 5, data analysis must demonstrate fidelity to the data. And number 6, validation procedures should be in place and used. And number 7, the reporting should be fair and seen to be fair by the readers. After verifying or validating the data, the next stage is reporting. And maybe that is the final stage before proofreading. So reporting is, the nature of the reporting will be decided to some extent by the nature of the interviewing. For example, a standardized structured interview may yield numerical type of data that may be reported succinctly in tables and graphs, while a qualitative word-based open-ended interview will yield word-based accounts that take up considerably more space. Quayle 1996 on page 263 to 6 suggests several elements of a report. Well, he has mentioned 4 different elements of a report. So a report is the writing stage after everything from designing to conducting and validating has been done. The report is prepared. So what are those stages? Number 1, a report must have this component, an introduction that includes the main themes and contents, an outline of the methodology and methods, from designing to interviewing, transcription and analysis. The results, number 3. Findings. The results, the data analysis, interpretation and verification, and number 4 would be a discussion. So these are the 4 main major components of any report. If the report is numerical, then figures and tables might be appropriate at the analysis stage. But if the report is not a numerical, but based on the words, then there will be other types of issues. And those issues will be how to present particular quotations in the report, how to refer and relate your material, and how much quotations and where and in what order should be used in the report. Well, that was about interviewing. Now we move on to another topic that is not a single interview, but it is a group interview or a group interviewing. What we have discussed so far, that was about a single interview or interviewing. So this technique of group interviewing within the methodology of interviewing have grown. Its popularity is that of group interviewing. This is one of the techniques within the methodology of interviewing which have grown popularity, and that is called group interviewing. The advantages the authors identify include the potential for discussions to develop, thus yielding a wide range of responses. They explain such interviews are useful. Where they are useful? Where a group of people have been working together for some time or for common purpose, or where it is seen as important that everyone concerned is aware of what others in the group are saying. The group interview can generate a wider range of responses than in individual interviews. So Bogdan and Bicklin, 1992, on page 100, add that group interviews might be useful for gaining an insight into what might be pursued in subsequent individual interviews. There are practical and organizational advantages too. Pre-arranged groups can be used for the purpose in question by teachers with minimum disruption. And group interviews are often quicker than individual interviews and hence are time-saving. The group interview can also bring together people with varied opinions or as representatives of different collectivities. There are certain issues in the conduct of group interview, and they are such as how to divide your attention as interviewer and to share out the interviewee's responses, giving them all a chance to speak in a group interview. Do you ask everyone in a group interview to give a response to a question? Or how to handle people who are too quiet, too noisy, who monopolize the conversation, who argue and disagree with each other? What happens if people become angry with you or with each other during the interview? How to make people be quiet or stop talking while being polite? How to handle differences in how talkative people are, how to arrange turn-taking in a group interview, if appropriate. Do you ask named individuals questions? How can you have individuals answer without forcing them? How to handle a range of very different responses to the same questions. Different people in the group have different opinions. Why have you brought together the particular people in the group? Consideration who will be included in the group and who won't be. Do you want people to answer in a particular sequence? What to do if the more experienced people always answer first in a group interview? And as an interviewer, be vigilant to pick on people who are trying to speak. So that was about group interviewing. That is a recent phenomena developed in research methodologies. One type of group interview is basically interviewing children, that falls under this category. So if your research question is related with interviewing children, what should you keep in your mind? Well, it is important to understand the world of children through their own eyes rather than the lens of the adult. Children differ from adults in cognitive and linguistic development, attention and concentration span, ability to recall, life experiences, what they consider to be important, status and power. All of these have a bearing on the interview, and the children are different from the adults on all these points. So it is important to establish trust with children, to put the child at ease quickly, and to help him or her to feel confident, to avoid overreacting, that is, if the child is distracted, to make the interview non-threatening and enjoyable, to use straightforward language and child's language, to ask questions that are appropriate for the age of the child, to keep to the here and now, to avoid using why, when, and how questions with very young children below the age of 5, to ensure that children can understand abstract questions, often for older children, to allow time to think and to combine methods and activities in an interview like drawing, playing, writing, speaking, playing a game, using pictures, newspapers, toys, or photographs. So group interviewing can be useful with children, as it encourages interaction between the group rather than simply a response to an adult's question. Group interviews of children might also be less intimidating for them than individual interviews. So overcome children being easily distracted. Some interviews provide toys, pictures, and these can distract the children. So overcome children being easily distracted. So don't use the things which can distract the children. Avoid the researcher being seen as an authority figure. So don't become authoritative, like a teacher, a parent, or an adult in a powerful position. Understand what children mean and what they say, particularly with young children. Gather a lot of information in a short time. So children's attention span is limited. So have children reveal what they really think and feel rather than what they think the researcher wants to hear, and avoid the situation being seen by the child as a test. Keep the interview relevant. Overcome young children's unwillingness to contradict an adult or assertive themselves. Interview inarticulate, hesitant, and nervous children. Get the children's teacher away from the children. Respond to the child who says something, then immediately wishes she hadn't said it. Elicit genuine responses from children rather than simply responses to the interview situation. So get beyond the institutional head teachers or expected response. Keep children to the point. Avoid children being too extreme or destructive of each other's views. Pitch your language at the appropriate level. Avoid the interview being an arduous bore. Overcome children's poor memories. Avoid children being too focused on particular features or situations. Avoid the situation where the child will say yes to anything addressed. For example, by avoiding yes-no questions in favor of open-ended questions. Overcome the situation of the child saying anything in order to please. Overcome the proclivity of some children to say that they don't know, or simply shrug their shoulders and remain silent. Overcome the problem that some children will say anything rather than feel they do not have the answer. Overcome the problem that some children dominate the conversation. Avoid the problem of children feeling very exposed in front of their friends. Avoid children feeling uncomfortable or threatened, addressed perhaps, by placing children with their friends. Avoid children telling lies. That's about if you are interviewing children, the points to keep in. Now I would like to move on to the final topic of this session, and that's about some ethical issues. The ethical issues in interviewing. So interviews have an ethical dimension. They concern interpersonal interaction and produce information about the human condition. Although one can identify three main areas of ethical issues, such as informed consent, confidentiality, and the consequences of the interviews. So these need to be unpacked a little, as each is not unproblematic. So some of these points I have summarized here. Has the informed consent, ethical issues, has the informed consent of the interviewees been gained orally or in written form? Has this been obtained in writing or orally? Permission to interview them. How much information should be given in advance of the study? How much information should be given to the interviewees before the interview starts? How can adequate information be provided if the study is exploratory? Have the possible consequences of the research been made clear to the participants? Has care been taken to prevent any harmful effects of the research to the participants and to the others? To what extent do any potential benefits outweigh the potential harm done by the research, and how justifiable is this for conducting the research? How will the research benefit the participants? How will who will benefit from the research? To what extent is there reciprocity between what participants give to and receive from the research? Have confidentiality, anonymity, non-identifiability and non-traceability been guaranteed? Should participants' identities disguised? How does the Data Protection Act operate in interview situations? Who will have access to the data? What has been done to ensure that the interview is conducted in an appropriate, non-stressful, non-threatening manner? How will the data and transcriptions be verified and by whom? Who will see the results of the research? Will some parts be withheld? Who owned the data? At what stage does ownership of the data pass from interviewees to the interviewers? Are there rights of veto for what appears? To whom should sensitive data be made available? Should interview data on child abuse or drugs taking be made available with or without consent to parents? How far should the researcher's own agenda and views predominate? What if the researcher makes a different interpretation from the interviewee? Should the interviewees be told even if they have not asked for these interpretations? Well, that was all about using interviews as data collecting tools and the issues related with that one. We started with a number of questions about using interviews as a research tool for gathering data, from defining interviews, finding out the purposes of interviews, types of interviews, designing questions, scheduling interviews, conducting interviews, and ethical issues of interview in detail. So we have reached towards the end of this session, and we have also completed the topic using interviews as a research technique. Thank you very much for listening.